Good evening, and welcome back to the quiet frontier. Tonight we return to the wilderness, to the rivers, forests, and mountains of the early American frontier, where our story follows a young trapper named William as he learns the slow and patient life of the mountain men. Before we begin, I just want to take a brief moment to thank you for being here. This channel is still very new, and I'm putting a lot of time and care into writing these stories. While I do use some helpful tools along the way, every episode is carefully crafted, researched, and shaped into a peaceful story meant to help you relax, unwind, and drift off to sleep. If you find yourself enjoying the story tonight, a simple like on the video really does help the channel grow and lets me know you'd like to hear more of William's adventures. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let the sounds of the wilderness carry you away. Tonight's story begins in the pine forests of the northern frontier, where William the trapper continues the careful work of building his winter cabin before the cold mountain snows arrive. Morning at the cabin. Sight. Morning came slowly to the river valley. A pale grey light spread across the eastern sky long before the sun itself climbed above the mountains. The forest remained quiet for a time, the cool air of early morning lingering between the tall pines that lined the riverbank. William stirred beneath his blanket as the last coals of his campfire glowed faintly in the ring of stones beside him. He blinked awake and sat up slowly. The bed of spruce boughs beneath him rustled as he stretched his arms over his head. His shoulders carried the dull ache of yesterday's work, the kind of soreness that came from swinging an axe for hours and rolling heavy logs through the forest. William rubbed his hands together and breathed into them. The air felt colder this morning. Not winter cold, but close enough that he could feel the season slowly turning. He leaned forward and stirred the coals with a small stick. For a moment nothing happened. Then a faint red glow appeared beneath the ash. "Still alive," he murmured. He gathered a handful of dry pine twigs from the wood pile and placed them gently over the embers. The twigs caught quickly. Thin flames curled upward, and soon the small campfire crackled once more in the quiet morning air. William walked down to the river with his kettle and dipped it beneath the cold water. Mist drifted slowly along the surface of the river, rising like pale smoke in the chill of the early hour. He returned to the fire and hung the kettle above the flames. Breakfast was simple: a small piece of salted pork, a handful of cornmeal. The mixture simmered quietly while the first sunlight touched the distant ridges to the east. William ate slowly beside the fire, staring out across the trees toward the hills where his cabin clearing waited. Yesterday he'd cut the first logs. Today he would raise the first corner. That was the moment a cabin truly began. He finished the last bite of his meal and rinsed the kettle in the river before packing his few tools. The axe hung comfortably at his side. The new ash handle he had carved the day before still felt smooth and strong in his grip. William crossed the river along the familiar line of stones and climbed slowly through the pine forest. The clearing appeared between the trees soon after. 2 logs rested across the moss exactly where he had left them. The first held its carved notch. The second waited beside it. William stepped into the clearing and stood quietly for a moment. The cabin site looked peaceful in the morning light, but it would not stay empty for long. Today the walls would begin rising from the forest floor. William lifted the axe and walked toward the waiting logs. The work was ready to begin again. The first corner. William worked slowly. The axe rose and fell in steady rhythm as the second notch deepened along the end of the pine log. Each strike removed another small wedge of wood, scattering pale chips across the moss beneath his boots. Fresh pine sap filled the air. The smell was sharp and clean. William paused occasionally to brush the loose wood away with his hand so he could study the shape of the cut. A good notch needed to be smooth enough for the logs to settle tightly together. Too shallow, and the upper log would wobble. Too deep and the wood would weaken where the corner carried the weight of the walls above it. Whitlock had always said that corners were the bones of a cabin. Everything rests on them, he used to say. William shaved away another thin curl of wood with the edge of the axe. The hollow had nearly reached the right depth. He ran his fingers along the inside of the notch and nodded to himself. That would do. William set the axe aside and stood. Now came the heavy part. He planted his shoulder against the second log and pushed. The pine rolled slowly across the moss. Another push. The log turned again. Little by little he guided the heavy timber toward the first log resting in the clearing. Once the ends aligned, William crouched beside it and took hold of the trunk with both hands. He lifted. The log rose only a few inches at first. Heavy. Very heavy. William shifted his grip and tried again, raising one end high enough to slide it carefully across the notch of the lower log. The wood settled into place with a dull thud. For a moment William held it there to make sure it would stay, then he slowly released his grip. The upper log rested perfectly across the first. The two notches locked together snugly. William stepped back. There it was. The first corner of the cabin. Two logs crossing at right angles in the centre of the clearing. It did not look like much yet. But every trapper and settler who had ever built a log cabin knew that moment well. The moment when the first corner stood. William folded his arms and looked at the simple structure. In his mind he could already see the rest of the walls rising. More logs stacked above. Corners growing taller. The roof beams stretching overhead. But for now, there were just the two. Still, it was enough to make him smile. The cabin started, he said quietly. A breeze moved softly through the pine branches above the clearing. Somewhere deeper in the forest, a raven called, and beneath the tall trees of the Montana wilderness. The first corner of William the Trapper's winter cabin stood firmly in the morning light. The second corner. William stood for a long moment studying the two logs resting together in the clearing. The simple corner looked small against the wide forest around it. Moss covered the ground between the tall pines, and the stream nearby murmured softly as it slipped downhill toward the river. But the two logs had changed the clearing. Before, it had only been an open place in the woods. Now it had a beginning. William stepped forward and rested his hand against the upper log. The pine still felt cool from the morning air. A thin line of fresh sap glistened where the axe had bitten into the wood during yesterday's work. He nodded quietly to himself. The cabin had started, but two logs alone would not keep winter winds outside. He picked up the axe and walked back toward the fallen trunk lying across the forest floor. The rest of the pine waited where it had fallen the day before. Several more straight sections could still be cut from it before he needed to bring down another tree. William measured out the next 12-foot length with his steps. 1, 2, 3. Whitlock had taught him that trick during their first winter together. A man's own stride could become a measuring stick once he knew its length well enough. William marked the bark with the edge of his knife. Then he lifted the axe. The blade struck deep into the trunk. A sharp crack echoed through the quiet trees. He settled into the rhythm again. Swing, strike, pull free. Each blow sent pale chips of pine scattering across the moss. Woodcutting had a steady pace to it. Not hurried, not slow. Just a rhythm that carried a man forward until the work was finished. The new ash handle flexed slightly beneath William's grip with each strike. Strong wood. Whitlock had been right about that as well. Before long, the cut deepened enough that the trunk began to groan softly. William delivered 2 more heavy swings. The log separated with a dull snap and rolled free. He wiped his brow and set the axe aside for a moment. Another log ready. Now came the slow work of moving it. William cut a sturdy branch and slid it beneath the trunk as a lever. With steady pressure, he rolled the log forward across the soft moss. The pine turned slowly, then again. Little by little he guided it toward the growing cabin frame. When the log finally reached the corner already standing in the clearing, William stopped to catch his breath. 3 logs now rested there, the first corner and the next piece waiting to be shaped. He crouched beside the end of the new log and studied the grain carefully. Soon this one would receive its notch, and once it crossed the first 2, the second corner of the cabin would stand. William lifted the axe again. The forest fell quiet as the steel bit into pine once more, and with each careful cut, the walls of his winter shelter crept slowly higher among the pines of the Montana wilderness. Talking to the logs, William knelt beside the new log, turning the end of the pine slightly with his boot so the grain faced upward. 3 logs now rested in the clearing, 2 already locked together at the first corner, and this third one waiting patiently for its own notch to be carved. The forest around him was quiet, very quiet. Only the stream murmured nearby, and somewhere high above the trees a raven croaked once before drifting away on the wind. William picked up the axe. "Well," he said aloud, looking at the log, "let's see if you behave better than the last one." The pine log, of course, said nothing. William paused for a moment. Then he nodded thoughtfully. "Good. I like a cooperative piece of lumber." He raised the axe. The blade struck into the wood with a clean crack, sending a small wedge of pine flying across the moss. For a while the clearing filled with the steady rhythm of chopping. Strike, chip, strike again. The notch slowly began forming along the end of the log. William stopped occasionally to brush away the loose wood chips and inspect the shape. Not too deep, not too shallow. Whitlock had always said the notch should look like the log was smiling slightly. William squinted at it. He tilted his head. That looks more like a crooked grin. He stepped back and folded his arms, studying the log. The log continued to say absolutely nothing. William sighed. "You're not very helpful, you know that." He rubbed his beard thoughtfully, then chuckled quietly to himself. "Talking to logs now," he muttered. "That's a good sign." He glanced around the clearing just in case anyone might have been watching. Only the trees stood there, tall, silent, patient. "Well," he said, raising the axe again, "if I start answering myself too, we'll know it's time to visit civilization." The axe came down again. The notch deepened slowly. Wood chips scattered across the forest floor like pale feathers. After several more careful cuts, William set the axe down and ran his fingers along the hollow he'd carved. "Smooth enough," he nodded. "That'll hold." Now came the heavier part. He planted his shoulder against the log and pushed. The pine rolled across the moss with a dull scrape. Another push. The trunk turned again. William guided it carefully toward the first corner of the cabin. Once the ends aligned, he crouched beside it and lifted. The log rose slowly, very slowly. "Up you go," he muttered through clenched teeth. The timber slid into place across the lower log with a solid thump. William held it there for a moment before letting go. The notch settled neatly into the corner. 3 logs now formed an L shape in the clearing, the beginning of 2 walls. William stepped back and looked at it. "Well, I'll be," he said quietly. "It's starting to look like something." The breeze stirred the tops of the pines above him. Somewhere beyond the trees the raven called again. William placed his hands on his hips and studied the small structure. Then he nodded toward the logs. "Good work, gentlemen." He paused, looked around the empty clearing, then scratched the back of his head. "I really ought to stop saying things like that out loud. The problem with wind." William stepped back from the growing corner of the cabin and wiped the pine dust from his hands. 3 logs now rested together in the clearing. 2 formed the first corner, locked neatly by their notches, while the third stretched out to begin the second wall. The simple structure cast a long shadow across the moss as the morning sun climbed higher between the tall pines. William folded his arms and studied his work. From a distance it looked sturdy enough. But as he walked closer, he noticed something that every cabin builder eventually discovered. Gaps, small ones. Thin spaces where the round logs rested against each other. He crouched beside the wall and peered through one of them. On the other side he could see the forest clearly. The pine trunks, the moss, a squirrel hopping along a fallen branch. William scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Well," he said aloud, "that won't do in January." The log, once again, offered no opinion. Whitlock had explained this part during the long winter evenings beside the old cabin fire. Logs alone did not stop the wind. No matter how carefully they were cut, the round shape always left small openings between them. Those gaps had to be filled, otherwise winter winds would whistle straight through the walls like a cold flute. Whitlock had called the process chinking. First came a layer of soft material to pack the deeper spaces. Then a harder mixture spread over the outside to seal everything tight. William looked around the clearing. The forest floor already offered the first ingredient: moss. Thick green mats of it grew between the roots of the trees and along the shaded ground near the stream. The soft plant worked well as natural insulation, pressing easily into the cracks between logs. William walked over and pulled up a small handful. The moss came free in a damp clump. He squeezed it lightly between his fingers. Springy. Soft. It would pack nicely into the gaps once the walls were higher. William nodded. "Good to know you're useful," he said to the moss. He paused, looked at the moss again, then sighed. That sentence probably sounded strange. The clearing remained silent. William dropped the moss back onto the ground and walked back to the cabin corner. The chinking would come later, much later. First the walls had to rise higher. A man could not fill the cracks until the logs were stacked nearly shoulder height. But it was good to think ahead. Winter wind had a way of finding every weakness a cabin builder forgot. William rested his hand against the upper log and looked at the growing corner again. 3 logs so far, dozens more to go. He nodded toward the trees. "Well," he said, picking up the axe again, "no sense standing here talking to plants." The pine forest waited patiently around him. Another tree would need to fall soon, and with every log added to the growing walls, William's winter shelter crept one step closer to standing complete among the quiet pines of the Montana wilderness. Another tree falls. William rested the head of the axe against his shoulder and looked out across the trees surrounding the clearing. The fallen pine he had been cutting from since yesterday had nearly given all the straight logs it could offer. Only a few crooked sections remained along the upper part of the trunk, and those would be better suited for firewood later in the season. If the cabin walls were going to rise any higher, another tree would need to come down. William walked slowly along the edge of the clearing, studying the forest the way Whitlock had taught him. Not every tree made a good cabin log. Some grew twisted where the wind had bent them over the years. Others carried too many knots where branches once reached out toward the sun. A wall built from crooked timber would leave gaps large enough to invite the winter wind straight inside. After a few minutes he stopped beside a tall lodgepole pine. The trunk rose nearly straight as a spear into the sky. Very few branches grew along the lower half. William nodded. "That one'll do." He stepped back several paces and studied the direction the tree leaned. A careless cut could send a tree crashing the wrong way, crushing the cabin logs he had already placed, or worse, smashing the axe itself. Whitlock had once said that the forest gave plenty of warnings to men who paid attention. William took a slow breath and raised the axe. The blade struck deep into the pine with a sharp crack that echoed through the clearing. Fresh wood chips burst from the trunk. He swung again, then again. The steady rhythm returned. Strike, chip, strike. Each blow bit deeper into the wood, carving the angled cut that would guide the tree's fall. The smell of fresh pine filled the air again. William paused to catch his breath and leaned slightly on the axe handle. "That's right," he muttered to the tree. "Fall nice and polite now." The pine offered no promises. He walked to the opposite side of the trunk and began the second cut. The axe rose and fell with heavier swings now. The tree creaked faintly. A long crack whispered through the trunk. William stepped back. The pine began to lean, slowly at first, then faster. Branches scraped against neighbouring trees as the tall trunk tipped forward and crashed into the forest floor with a deep, echoing thud. The ground trembled slightly beneath William's boots. He nodded toward the fallen tree, much appreciated. Then he paused, looked around the clearing again. The tree stood quietly as always. William rubbed the back of his neck. "You know," he said slowly, "I really should stop thanking lumber." A breeze rustled through the pine needles overhead. William shrugged. Well, manners never hurt anyone. He lifted the axe again and walked toward the fallen tree. Branches needed trimming. Logs needed cutting. And with each piece of timber brought back to the clearing, the walls of his cabin would continue rising toward the sky. Building the walls. The fallen pine lay stretched across the forest floor like a giant spear thrown down among the trees. William walked along its length, studying the trunk carefully before beginning the next cut. The bark was rough beneath his hand, and fresh sap had already begun to bead along the bright wood where the axe had bitten moments earlier. A good tree, straight grain, strong wood. He nodded once and lifted the axe again. The blade struck deep into the trunk with a solid crack. Soon the steady rhythm of chopping returned to the clearing. Swing, strike, pull free. Wood chips scattered across the moss with each blow. William worked patiently, carving through the trunk until the next 12-foot log began to separate from the tree. When the final fibres split with a dull snap, the log rolled slightly across the ground. William wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve. Another good piece. He trimmed the remaining branches quickly, and then began the familiar work of moving the heavy timber. A sturdy branch served again as his lever. With steady pressure he rolled the log slowly across the forest floor toward the clearing where the first corner of the cabin waited. The moss made the work easier than bare dirt would have. Still, the pine was heavy, very heavy. By the time the log reached the growing structure, William's shoulders burned with effort. He rested a moment and leaned against the trunk, catching his breath. The cabin corner stood quietly before him. 3 logs already stacked. Soon there would be 4. William crouched beside the end of the new log and began carving the notch that would lock it into place. Smaller strokes now replaced the heavy chopping used to cut the tree. Thin curls of wood peeled away from the blade. The hollow took shape slowly beneath his careful hands. Once the notch was finished, William set the axe aside and positioned himself beside the log. "All right," he muttered. He lifted. The log rose only slightly at first. Then with another effort he guided the end upward and slid it across the wall already standing. The wood settled neatly into the corner notch with a dull thump. William stepped back. 4 logs now formed the first layer of the cabin walls, 2 running one direction, 2 running the other. A square had begun to appear in the clearing. He walked slowly around the small frame, studying it from every angle. The walls were still only knee-high, but now the shape of the cabin could finally be seen. William rested his hands on his hips. "Well," he said aloud, "that's starting to look like a house." He paused, looked around the empty forest again, then chuckled softly. Or at least the idea of one. A breeze drifted through the trees and stirred the pine needles above. William nodded toward the half-built walls. "Don't worry," he said to them, "we'll get you taller." And with that he lifted the axe once more, because there were still many trees standing in the forest, and every one of them was a future wall waiting to be cut, gathering moss. By the time the fourth log settled into place, the sun had begun drifting lower toward the western hills. The light in the clearing had softened, turning the pine trunks a warm golden colour, where the beams slipped through the branches above. William stood beside the growing cabin frame and stretched his arms slowly. The walls now reached nearly to his knees, not tall, but enough that he could finally walk around the square outline and see exactly where the door would stand, where the fire would burn, and where his bed might rest during the long winter nights. He crouched beside one of the walls and looked again at the narrow gaps between the logs. Even with the notches cut carefully, the round shapes of the pine trunks left small spaces between them, places where cold wind would slip through easily once the snow began to fall. William ran his fingers along one of the openings. Whitlock's voice came back to him as clearly as if the old trapper were standing nearby. "Logs stop the weather," Whitlock had once said, "but chinking stops the wind." William nodded. Chinking. First the soft filler, then the sealing layer. The moss he had noticed earlier would serve well for the first part. He walked a short distance into the trees where the forest floor dipped slightly near the stream. Thick patches of moss grew there in deep green carpets between the roots of the pines. William knelt and pulled up a handful. The moss came loose easily, its soft fibres holding together like a sponge. He squeezed it gently. Springy, light, perfect for stuffing into the spaces between the logs. "This'll do," he said. He gathered another handful, and then another, forming a small pile beside the cabin wall. Soon several soft bundles of moss rested near the corner. William crouched beside the wall again and pressed one clump gently into the gap between the lower logs. The moss packed tightly into the space. It fit well. Not permanent yet, but enough to block the wind once the cabin stood taller. He leaned back on his heels and studied the wall. "Not bad," he muttered. Then he looked down at the moss pile beside him. "You're going to be a wall some day." The moss pile did not seem particularly impressed. William rubbed his beard thoughtfully. "I suppose that sounded strange too." The clearing remained silent except for the soft murmur of the stream. He chuckled quietly to himself. Months alone in the wilderness had a way of making a man appreciate conversation wherever he could find it, even if the conversation came from moss. William stood and dusted his hands. The rest of the chinking would come later. Once the walls rose to chest height, he would gather clay from the river bank and mix it with soil and grass to seal the outside of the gaps. For now, the cabin needed more logs. Many more. He looked around the clearing again. The small square of timber resting in the moss had begun to resemble something real, a place where winter could be endured. William picked up the axe once more and rested it across his shoulder. "Well," he said to the half-built walls, "let's make you a little taller." And beneath the quiet pine trees of the Montana wilderness, the work of building continued. The weight of the work. William walked slowly around the small frame of the cabin once more before returning to the fallen tree. 4 logs now formed the base of the walls. The square shape sat quietly in the clearing, its corners locked together just as Whitlock had taught him. From a distance, it almost looked like the beginning of a small corral rather than a house. But William could already see what it would become. He stepped over the trunk of the fallen pine and measured out another section with his stride. 1 step, 2, 3, 12 feet again. The mark of his knife scratched lightly across the bark where the next log would be cut. William lifted the axe. The blade struck deep into the trunk with a sharp crack. The sound echoed through the trees and rolled across the hills before fading into the distance. Swing, strike, pull free. The rhythm returned once again. Wood chips flew across the forest floor while the cut slowly deepened into the pine. The new ash handle flexed slightly with each blow, absorbing the shock of the strikes. William paused halfway through the cut and leaned against the axe. His arms had begun to feel heavy. Cabin building had a way of reminding a man how small he was compared to the forest. He glanced at the towering pines around him. "So many trees," he muttered, "and I only need, 20 more?" He rubbed the back of his neck and sighed. "Well, that seems reasonable." The forest remained politely silent. William shook his head with a faint grin and lifted the axe again. The cut deepened quickly now. Soon the log separated from the trunk with a dull crack and rolled free across the moss. William rested for a moment before trimming the branches away. Each smaller limb snapped free beneath the axe blade until the trunk lay smooth and ready to be moved. He planted the lever branch beneath the log and pushed. The pine rolled slowly, then again. Little by little, the heavy timber crept across the clearing toward the cabin frame. By the time the log reached the walls, William's breathing had grown heavier, and a thin line of sweat ran down the side of his face despite the cool mountain air. He rested both hands on the trunk and caught his breath. "This," he said between breaths, "is why cabins usually come with neighbours." He looked around the clearing again. The trees stood quietly as always. William nodded toward them. "Don't worry, I wasn't asking." After a moment, he crouched beside the end of the log and began carving the notch. The axe moved with smaller, careful strokes now. Thin curls of pine peeled away as the hollow slowly formed. Soon the notch was ready. William set the axe aside and gripped the log. He lifted. The timber rose slowly but steadily. With a final effort, he slid the end into place along the growing wall. The wood settled into the corner notch with a solid thud. William stepped back and studied the structure again. 5 logs now formed the base of the cabin walls. The square stood a little taller, a little stronger, a little closer to becoming the shelter he would depend on when the snow began to fall. William rested his hands on his hips and nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "We're getting somewhere." Above him the wind moved gently through the tops of the pine trees, and beneath the wide Montana sky. The walls of William the Trapper's cabin continued their slow climb toward winter. The shape of a cabin. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the western hills when William finished placing the 5th log. The clearing held that quiet golden light that often came in the late afternoon, when the day's warmth lingered but the cool breath of evening was already beginning to drift down from the mountains. William stepped back from the growing walls and stretched his arms slowly. The muscles along his shoulders ached from the steady work of the day. Swinging the axe, rolling logs, lifting timber, every motion had added its small weight to the hours. But the work had paid off. He walked slowly around the small frame now standing in the clearing. 5 logs formed the walls, 2 running one direction, 2 running the other, and the newest log resting across the top of the first layer. The cabin had begun to rise, not tall yet, but tall enough that William could finally see the outline of the room where he would spend the winter months. He paused near one corner and imagined where the door would go. Most mountain men kept their cabins simple. 1 door, 1 small window if they were lucky enough to trade for glass, and a stone fireplace built along the back wall. William crouched and ran his hand along the smooth pine of the upper log. The wood still smelled fresh from the axe. Sap glistened faintly where the bark had been trimmed away earlier in the day. He nodded to himself. This'll hold. The breeze stirred the pine branches overhead. Somewhere deeper in the forest, a woodpecker tapped slowly against a hollow trunk. William stood again and rested his hands on his hips. "Well," he said to the half-built walls, "you're not much to look at yet." He paused, looked around the clearing again, then chuckled softly. "Course neither am I after hauling you round all day." The trees gave no reply. The cabin walls remained just as quiet. William shook his head with a faint grin. "All right then." He walked to the edge of the clearing and gathered his tools. The axe rested comfortably across his shoulder once more. Tomorrow there would be more logs to cut, more notches to carve, more moss to gather for the spaces between the walls. Cabins grew slowly, but they grew steadily if a man kept working. William gave the structure one last look before turning toward the river trail. 5 logs now stood where empty forest had been only 2 days before. It was not much yet, but it was enough to prove that the cabin was real. And with each passing day, those walls would continue climbing toward the sky. William stepped into the trees and began the walk back to camp, while the last light of the day settled quietly over the Montana wilderness. Night beside the river. By the time William reached the river again, the sun had slipped almost completely behind the western ridge. The sky above the valley glowed with the last colours of evening, deep orange fading slowly into purple, where the first stars were beginning to appear. William stepped carefully across the familiar stones that carried him over the cold current. The river whispered softly beneath his boots as the water slipped between the rocks and roots along the bank. On the far side, the small clearing of his camp waited quietly among the trees. Only a faint glow remained where the coals of his fire rested in the ring of stones. William knelt beside the fire pit and stirred the ashes gently with a stick. The coals brightened immediately. A warm red glow returned beneath the grey ash. "Still holding on," he said quietly. He added a few small pieces of pine and watched as thin flames rose once more into the cool evening air. Soon the fire crackled steadily again. William sat beside it and stretched his legs out toward the warmth. The long day of work settled into his bones now that the motion had stopped. His arms felt heavy, his shoulders sore, but it was the good kind of tired that came from honest labour. 5 logs now formed the base of his cabin walls. He pictured the clearing in his mind as he stared into the flames, the corner notches, the square frame taking shape, the moss waiting nearby to fill the cracks. Another week of work like today, and the walls might reach his waist. Another week after that, and they might reach his shoulders. Slow work, but steady. William pulled his blanket around his shoulders as the evening air cooled further. Somewhere along the river bank an owl called softly into the darkness. The sound echoed once across the valley before fading away again. William leaned back against the fallen log beside his fire and looked up through the branches of the tall pines. The stars had fully appeared now, bright and sharp in the wide Montana sky. He exhaled slowly. "You know," he murmured quietly, "if this keeps up, I might actually finish that cabin." He paused, then nodded slightly to himself. "And if I keep talking to myself like this, I might need neighbours too." The fire popped softly beside him. The river continued its steady whisper through the valley, and beneath the quiet sky of the northern frontier, William the trapper rested beside the warmth of his fire, knowing that the walls of his winter shelter were already beginning to rise among the pines. Next time on the adventures of William the Trapper, William continues raising the walls of his cabin higher among the pines. With the logs now beginning to stack above waist height, he must begin preparing the chinking that will seal the gaps between the logs and keep the bitter winter winds outside where they belong. And as the days grow colder in the mountains, the first signs of approaching winter begin to appear.